Clarence Delroy was 82 years old when he arrived at Union Station in Washington, D.C. on a cool morning that smelled faintly of diesel, coffee, and sweet pastries from a nearby vendor. He wore his best suit, a brown wool blazer over a crisp white shirt, and freshly pressed slacks that hung a little loose around his waist. His shoes were polished with care, not because anyone might notice, but because it mattered to him. A brown felt hat sat lightly atop his head, slightly worn at the edges but still dignified. In one hand, he carried a weathered leather bag, and in the other, he held a letter wrapped carefully in his blazer pocket, a letter from the widow of a dear friend, a general whose funeral he was attending. The letter bore a simple message on its front. Mr. Clarence Delroy, please escort to front. Sincerely, Rebecca Beckett. This letter was his pass, his invitation, the key to a seat at the funeral of a man he had known for more than 70 years. Clarence's movements were slow, but steady as he stepped off the train and into the bustling station. The city around him buzzed with noise, a mixture of voices, footsteps, and the distant rumble of vehicles. He moved with the measured gait of a man who had spent decades on hard floors, years pushing a mop at Langston High School in Birmingham, Alabama. 43 years of teaching and caretaking, never missing a day except for the week after his wife passed away. Now, it was just him, alone with memories and a quiet dignity that no one could take away. Across the aisle, a woman in her late 30s noticed him. Her eyes softened as she offered a polite smile and asked if he was visiting family. Clarence gave a small smile back and replied simply, "No, ma'am, a friend's funeral." She nodded gently, her voice lowering with sympathy. Clarence didn't need to explain more. Some things didn't need words, not today. The taxi ride from the station to Arlington National Cemetery was quiet. Clarence handed the driver the address, and the man nodded knowingly. "Big service today," he said. "Chewing gum. 4-star general. Should be packed." Clarence only nodded in return. He was a good man, the driver said, but didn't ask for details. He didn't need to. The city slowly gave way to monuments, trees, and waving flags. Clarence's thoughts drifted back to Montgomery Road in Tuskegee, Alabama, where he had first met Thomas Becket in 1949. One was a preacher's son, the other a boy from the mill houses. They had been inseparable since childhood, playing stickball, getting into fights over nothing, sharing cold watermelon on hot days. They had gone to war together in 1967, but only one had returned with medals. Clarence didn't care about medals. What mattered was the bond they shared. When the taxi pulled up near the south gate of Arlington, Clarence handed over a $20 bill and stepped out slowly. Rows of cars lined the street, and men in uniform stood at attention along the walkway. A long black hearse was parked ahead, surrounded by dozens of white folding chairs neatly arranged under a green canopy. The funeral was almost ready to begin. Clarence paused, adjusting his collar, and pulled out the letter once more. He looked at it for a moment before tucking it carefully back into his coat. His heart was steady but heavy. He began to walk toward the main entrance, alone and unnoticed. Carrying decades of quiet history, no one here seemed ready to understand. The moment Clarence stepped onto the sidewalk, trouble appeared. 2 young officers in crisp dress blues stood at the checkpoint, their eyes scanning guests with practiced attachment. One was barely 25, the other slightly taller. Clarence greeted them politely and reached into his blazer, holding out the letter from Rebecca Beckett, the widow. "Good morning, sirs," he said. "I'm here for General Beckett's service. His wife asked me to show this." The shorter officer took the envelope, squinting at the handwriting, then glanced up with a tight smile. "Sir, do you have your name on the official list?" Clarence shook his head. "I was told this would do." The taller officer leaned over to read the letter, then said, "We need to verify names through the master list. Orders come from the family liaison." Clarence stayed quiet for a moment before speaking, his voice calm but heavy with meaning. "I came a long way. I just want to pay my respects. That man meant the world to me." The younger officer shifted uncomfortably. "I hear you, sir, but without clearance we can't let you in. This is a high-level event. It's not personal." Clarence looked past them toward the rows of seats filling quickly. The ceremony hadn't started yet, but people moved with purpose, brass buttons, flags, somber faces. He heard a bugler warming up in the distance. He removed his hat, holding it to his chest, and tried again. "I'm not here to cause trouble. That man back there," he pointed toward the hearse, "I pulled him out of a rice field with a hole in his chest. I ain't trying to steal nobody's seat." But the officers didn't budge. "I'm sorry, sir," the taller one repeated. "We have our orders." Clarence stepped back, hands steady but eyes downcast. A couple passed by, whispering as they walked. One older man in a gray suit offered a small, awkward nod but kept moving. Clarence moved to the side and leaned against the stone wall near the gate. His knees ached from the long ride, and sweat beaded on his brow. He wiped it with a handkerchief. From his coat pocket, he pulled out a folded photograph, worn and soft at the creases. It showed two young men muddy and smiling in fatigues. Beckett had his arm around Clarence's shoulder, both laughing as if the world had not caught fire around them. He stared at the photo, then folded it back into his coat. Minutes passed. The officers returned to scanning guests and waving people through. A woman dressed all in black brushed past him, smelling faintly of perfume and powder. A child followed, bouncing slightly in shiny shoes. Clarence stood still, hopeful but fading. His eyes drifted back to the green canopy, where the casket rested beneath the American flag. A younger soldier, carrying a clipboard, walked by. Clarence called softly, "Son." The soldier turned. "Yes, sir." "I serve with the general," Clarence said, showing the envelope. The soldier read it and offered a half-smile. "Let me check with the list coordinator." He disappeared inside the gate. 10 more minutes passed. No one returned. Clarence shifted his weight. Still waiting, still invisible. Clarence wasn't one to raise his voice, but he watched the ceremony begin without him. The sun climbed higher over Arlington National Cemetery, casting long shadows across the rows of white headstones as the service for General Thomas Becket began without Clarence Delroy. The sound of a bugler's mournful notes echoed across the green fields, mingling with the quiet murmurs of the gathered crowd. Clarence stood just outside the gate, clutching the letter from Rebecca Becket, the general's widow, his presence overlooked by those entrusted with enforcing protocol. He watched as uniformed officers and civilians alike moved with purpose beneath the canopy, their faces solemn but unfamiliar. The weight of his invisibility settled heavily on his shoulders, not because of the years etched into his bones, but because he had known the man whose life was being honored better than most here. More than 60 years had passed since he and Thomas had first crossed paths, but the memories clung tightly. The boy from the mill houses, the preacher's son, the soldier he had dragged from the rice fields of Vietnam. Clarence's knees ached with the long hours spent standing, but he did not complain. He had endured far worse, and his spirit remained unbroken. The years spent teaching in a Birmingham high school had given him a resilience few could understand, and though his body slowed, his mind remained sharp. As guests filled the front rows, Clarence's thoughts drifted to the battlefields of South Vietnam. The jungle had been thick with smoke and gunfire, the air heavy with the cries of men fighting for their lives. He remembered crouching behind a tree stump, rifle in hand, heart pounding as he scanned the smoke for danger. Lieutenant Thomas Becket had been bleeding from a shoulder wound, helmet gone, face streaked with dirt, struggling to stay upright. The radio was dead, and the platoon was trapped. Without hesitation, Clarence had grabbed his friend, throwing him over his shoulder and charging toward a shallow trench half covered by tangled brush. He recalled the burst of gunfire, the sudden release of purple smoke from a grenade tossed into the enemy's midst, and the desperate, low crawl to safety. That day, Thomas had called him his shadow, though they rarely spoke of it once back home. The medals Becket received were not for Clarence, but the bond they shared was the real honor. Back in the present, Clarence adjusted the armband Becket had made for him all those years ago. The faded green cloth, stitched with fishing line, bore Thomas's initials. It was a reminder that, even when apart, part of them remained together. He tried again to gain entry, tapping a junior officer on the shoulder. "Sir," Clarence said with more urgency, "I came here because General Becket asked me to. That letter, it's from his wife." The officer looked genuinely uncomfortable, but shook his head. "We have strict protocol today. I can't make exceptions." When Clarence asked of the family liaison, Rebecca, could be brought out. He was told she was inside and unavailable. No one was willing to bend the rules. Clarence stepped back, feeling the weight of rejection. The chairs near the canopy filled with people, some making space for dignitaries in dark uniforms who move with authority. The ceremony was underway, and yet he stood outside the gates, invisible. The opening prayer began, followed by a eulogy that spoke of duty, honor, and legacy. But Clarence's mind was elsewhere, recalling a simpler time with his friend. He thought about the summer in 1955, when Thomas had broken his arm trying to climb a water tower behind a farm. He remembered how they had walked home together, Thomas crying silently while Clarence carried him. Those moments held more meaning than any ceremony. Suddenly, a tall figure in full uniform appeared at the edge of the crowd. General Raymond Callister, for stars gleaming on his shoulders, moved with purpose toward the gate. Known for commanding respect through fairness and loyalty, he was a man who did not waste time or words. Callister approached Clarence with steady eyes that seemed to see beyond the suit and tired skin. "What is your name?" he asked, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. Clarence stepped forward. "Clarence Delroy." The general nodded slowly. "You knew General Beckett?" Clarence's voice caught, but he answered steadily. "Since I was 9. Served with him in Contum, 1968. Without hesitation, Callister raised his hand in a firm military salute. A real salute, full of respect and recognition. Clarence blinked, caught off guard, but slowly raised his hand in return. It was not perfect, his fingers wavering, but it carried the weight of years shared in hardship and brotherhood. Callister spoke again. "Mr. Delroy, would you allow me the honor of escorting you to your seat?" Clarence nodded wordlessly, and together they walked shoulder to shoulder toward the ceremony. The crowd fell silent as the two men moved through the rows. Officers and guests watched, some nodding quietly, others wiping tears. Junior officers stepped aside without a word. The seat beside Rebecca Beckett, the general's widow, was saved. When Clarence sat down, straightening his blazer, it was clear this was not a matter of protocol, but a recognition of something deeper. Rebecca reached out, placing her hand lightly on Clarence's, holding it as the chaplain resumed the service. The moment was quiet and sacred. Around them, the American flag draped the casket, wreaths arranged with care, and a photograph of Thomas Beckett in his final tour, steady and determined. Clarence barely noticed the other guests. None had shared the trials of Vietnam or the silent moments on the porch years later. As the service ended, Theodore Beckett, one of Thomas's sons, leaned over to Clarence. "Thank you," he said softly. "Dad talked about you often. Said you were the reason he made it home." Clarence smiled gently. "We kept each other alive." Later, as the last guest drifted away, Clarence remained seated, the folded flag resting in his lap. Rebecca handed him a sealed envelope. No stamp, no address, just his name in Thomas's unmistakable script. He waited until the bugle's final note faded and the rifle salute echoed to the hills before opening it. The letter spoke of regret and brotherhood, of battles fought and promises kept. Thomas wrote of choosing Clarence to wear his ceremony pin, of admiration and unspoken gratitude. It was a message from a friend who had known him before the medals, before the ranks, before the public honors. A message about being seen and remembered. Clarence read slowly, absorbing every word, his fingers trembling. Tears escaped quietly, and he wiped them away with the back of his hand. No drama, just truth. As the funeral drew to a close, Clarence Delroy remained seated for a while longer, holding the folded flag carefully in his lap. The crowd had thinned. Whispers and conversations replaced the solemn prayers and eulogies. Around him, people gathered their belongings, some still processing what they had witnessed. This quiet man who had been overlooked, then honored by a 4-star general who recognized a lifetime of loyalty and sacrifice. Clarence's eyes drifted to the casket, the flag's red, white, and blue colors vibrant against the muted greens and grays of Arlington's landscape. He could feel the weight of the day pressing down, not just on his body but on his heart. The letter from Thomas Beckett rested in his hand, its words echoing like a promise made long ago and finally fulfilled. He thought about the decades that had passed, years of friendship, battles fought side by side, moments shared in silence. He remembered the boy who stole his lunch and gave it back, the soldier who trusted him with his life, the friend who had never forgotten him despite medals and rank. And now, in this final farewell, Clarence knew that he too had been seen. Slowly, he rose from his seat, the flag still cradled carefully. He tucked the letter into his coat and made his way toward the casket once more. General Callister remained seated nearby, watching silently, a sentinel of respect and understanding. Clarence approached the casket and rested his hand on the polished wood. For a moment, he closed his eyes and took a deep breath. His voice was steady as he spoke, not to the crowd, but to the friend he had lost. "I know I ain't supposed to speak, but I need to say something, not for the general, not even for his family, but for me." He paused, gathering strength. "I knew Tom Beckett before any of y'all called him sir, before the medals, before the speeches. He was just Tom to me, the boy who stole my lunch twice and gave it back both times because he felt bad." A few in the crowd smiled quietly. "I carried him once when he was bleeding out and cussing me the whole way. And he carried me too, not literally, maybe, but in ways that matter." Clarence glanced at General Callister, who nodded faintly in encouragement. "I got told I didn't belong here, that I wasn't on no list, that maybe I was just some old man, but I was also Tom's brother." He looked back to the casket. "And I'm proud of that." Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, Clarence raised his hand and gave a salute. It was not perfect. The elbow wavered, his fingers did not line up, but was full of memory, of mud and sweat, of tears and years. It carried the weight of survival and friendship. The command rang out sharply. "Detail attention!" Clarence turned to see General Callister rise, facing the casket. The 4-star general's salute was flawless, sharp, proud, and commanding. Around them, nearly 24 uniformed service members snapped to attention and raised their hands in unison. This was no mere ceremony. It was a tribute to a man who deserved to be seen. Clarence stood frozen, caught between pride and the deep weight of it all. For the first time that day, he did not feel like an outsider fighting to prove his place. He knew he belonged. The general stepped forward, lowering his hand and extending it toward Clarence. "Mr. Delroy," he said quietly but clearly, "thank you for your service. To this country and to General Beckett." Clarence grasped the offered hand, shaking it firmly. "You honored him today," Callister continued, "more than any words I've ever heard spoken." Clarence nodded slowly. "He honored me long before this, and long after the uniforms left." The crowd began to disperse as the last cars rolled away and the canopy was taken down. Clarence lingered by the grave, the folded flag still held close. The cemetery workers moved silently around him, waiting patiently but not rushing. The day had ended, but Clarence's journey was not quite complete. He found a seat on a nearby stone ledge, the flag resting gently across his knees. His body protested the weight of the day, but he ignored the ache. He leaned forward, looking once more at the casket before it would be lowered into the earth. "I told myself I wouldn't talk too long," he muttered quietly, as if speaking only to himself or perhaps to Tom. "But I guess that ship sailed." His voice softened, no longer addressing the crowd, but the friend who had shaped his life. He recalled the summer of '55, the broken arm, the rusty ladder, and the silent walk home with a crying boy. "You never listened, Tom," he chuckled softly under his breath. Clarence remembered the look on Tom's mother's face, the cold rag she handed him, and the way she pointed to the porch. "I never said it right before," he continued. "Probably because I didn't know how, but I loved you like my own blood. You weren't just a friend, you were family." His voice cracked as the years of friendship, loss, and survival came rushing through. "I guess I always thought we'd go out together someday. Side by side, gray and slow, arguing about whose knees hurt worse or who forgot the fishing poles." He pulled a thin chain from his coat pocket, the dog tags Tom had given him just before redeployment in 1970. Running his thumb over the cold metal, Clarence crouched carefully and set the tags gently on the casket surface. "I figure it's time they go back where they belong." He straightened with effort, looking down at the ground beneath his feet. "I'll carry what's left of you as Tom, like always. But I want you to know, whatever you thought you owed me, you paid it in full. Every time you showed up, every time you called, Every time he let me sit on that porch and just be seen. He blinked slowly, the quiet truth settling deep within. I'll be all right. I'll keep walking. But I won't forget. I can't. Then, with hands raised and clasped together, Clarence closed his eyes. Lord, thank you for letting me know this man. Thank you for letting us grow old, even if we didn't grow old together. And thank you for letting him rest today with someone who remembered who he really was. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves overhead. A bird called once before flying away. Clarence gave the casket one last look, then turned slowly but with steady purpose. He began the long walk back down the paved road, step by step, past the empty chairs, past the now silent hillside. Each footstep was grounded in memory and honor. A week later, back in Birmingham, Clarence was kneeling on the front porch of a neighbor's house. Her door kept sticking, and he had promised to fix it. The morning sun beat down fiercely, but Clarence didn't hesitate. With a screwdriver, wood filler, and a small folding stool that creaked under his weight, he got to work. The neighbor brought out a glass of lemonade, urging him to take a break. Clarence accepted, took a sip, and returned to the task. This was how he had always lived, not waiting for things to get worse, doing what needed to be done. Suddenly, the neighbor's son ran down the steps, holding a phone. "Mr. Clarence, you're on the internet," he exclaimed. Clarence blinked, confused. The boy spun the phone around, showing grainy footage of General Callister walking across the cemetery, stopping at the gate and saluting Clarence. The moment of stillness was watched by millions online. Clarence watched quietly, then handed the phone back. "That's something," he said simply. The boy looked confused, expecting more excitement. Clarence smiled gently. "That wasn't for the cameras, son. That was just a man doing right by another man." Back in his home, the photographs and letters from the funeral sat on the kitchen table. The flag was folded neatly inside a glass case. Local reporters, veterans groups, and even a podcast producer from California reached out, saying the moment deserved to be heard. Clarence told them all the same thing. He had said what needed to be said. One morning, he sat at the dining table and wrote a letter to General Callister. "Thank you for stopping, for looking me in the eye, for not needing proof. I didn't expect what you did, but I won't forget it. You saw me and you saw Tom in me. That's enough. Clarence Delroy." He mailed it the next day without a return address, and life went on. Clarence continued fixing windows, volunteering at the high school library, organizing books, sometimes falling asleep in the quiet corners when no one was looking. People recognized him from the funeral footage and thanked him, but he never told the whole story. Not because he didn't want to, but because some stories are sacred, living only between two people, and one was already gone. Weeks later, while walking past a small park, Clarence noticed a young man in uniform sitting alone on a bench. The soldier looked restless, perhaps pre-deployment, or burdened with other worries. Clarence sat beside him without a word, resting his hands on his cane. After a moment, the soldier spoke softly. "You're that guy from Arlington." Clarence smiled gently, but said nothing. The soldier nodded. "My granddad showed me the video. Said that's how men used to carry themselves." Clarence exhaled slowly and gazed toward the trees. We just tried not to forget each other. They sat together in silence for a while before Clarence rose to leave. The young man stood and saluted him. No audience, no cameras, just one man honoring another. Clarence tipped his hat in return. In the end, it was never about recognition or applause, not for him, not for Tom. It was about showing up, keeping promises, being seen when it mattered most. And maybe, just maybe, reminding the world what honor still looks like. If this story moved you, share it with someone who deserves to be remembered. And if you have a Clarence in your life, someone who has walked beside you quietly, let them know today